Hi pals, today we are going to be talking about complex patterns of inheritance. Make sure that you are following the instructions on Schoology, so you've done the predict before you got to this part, and be sure you're taking notes while you're watching. All right, so in our previous standards, we learned about Mendel's principles. So let's review those, right? So one of his laws was this idea that parents pass down something to their offspring that gives them their traits, right? So Mendel called them genes. He didn't know they were made of DNA. We know that now. But he was able to theorize that there was something passed down from parent to offspring, giving them characteristics. Mendel also said where there are more than two forms of the gene, sometimes one of those forms or alleles is dominant and sometimes one is recessive, right? So dominant means you only need one of those alleles to show the trait. Recessive would mean you need two. The law of segregation was another one of Mendel's principles. So this said that during gamete formation, so meiosis, right, during meiosis, that parents are going to, the parents' genes are going to split so that you get one copy of it, right? So again, you have one chromosome number 8 from mom, you have one from dad. When your sex cells are made, those separate from each other. And then 4, the way that those alleles separate are independent of each other, right? So it's not like all of moms line up over here, all of dads over here, and they separate, right? They're randomly mixed in. So those were Mendel's laws of inheritance. We talked about them in an earlier standard, right? And what we saw again was this idea of dominant and recessive. Now we're gonna look at other ways that traits are inherited. So what would happen if one's not completely dominant? What would happen if there's not just two alleles? That's what we're looking at now today. So for some of you guys, in your research for Standard 5, you're just going to be talking about dominant and recessive. So if you have a simple pattern of inheritance, that's what you'll talk about. But some of you have complex patterns of inheritance, which is what we're going to talk about today. So not everything is simple inheritance, right? And in fact, when we look at most of our actual traits, they don't follow simple inheritance. So most genes have more than two forms, right? There's usually a lot of alleles for each gene. And most of our important traits are not determined by one gene. So think about height, right? So people want to say like, oh, my dad's tall, my mom's tall, why aren't I tall, right? Height is something that's determined by more than one gene. So there's always going to be variation. And then sometimes we're going to have traits where alleles aren't completely dominant. Right, so there's all these different things that can happen instead of just simple inheritance. All right, so one example of complex inheritance is called incomplete dominance. So incomplete dominance is when you have alleles that are not completely dominant over the other. And instead you're going to get a phenotype, a physical trait, that is in the middle of these two other phenotypes, right? So in the pictures there, flower color is an example, right? So you have a red allele, you have a white allele. Neither are completely dominant, which means if an individual has one big R and one big W, they're going to have this pink flower instead, right? So you can see this heterozygous individual is somewhere between the phenotypes of both alleles. That's incomplete dominance. Codominance is another example where the individuals or where the alleles aren't completely dominant, right? Codominance is a little bit different though, because rather than blending, right, you're gonna show both phenotypes clearly in different spots. So looking at that little chicken, right, he looks like he's peppered, right? That's what we call him, that color peppered. That's because both white and black are codominant. So some areas, some feathers are white and some are black because it's codominant. That flower there, right, some areas are pink, some areas are white because pink and white are codominant for that flower. So I like to think of a co-captain on a team, right? They're two individuals working together. Codominance, you have two separate phenotypes, right? You're not going to have that blending like you see in incomplete dominance. Another thing that can happen is a gene can have more than two alleles, right? So rather than just having like red or white, right? Two forms of the gene, there are many. So an example of this is human blood type. Okay, so there are 3 different alleles for blood type. There's A, there's B, and then there's O, right? So A, B, and O are 3 different alleles. So there's not just 2 forms of the gene now, right? We actually have 4 because there are these different alleles. So multiple alleles just means more than 2 alleles. Another thing that can happen are polygenic traits. So these are traits that are determined by several genes, right? Hair color and eye color are really good examples of this. So if you think about hair color, right? If I say I have brown hair, there's lots of other people that have brown hair, but we don't all have the exact same shade of hair. Same idea with eyes, right? Just because someone has blue eyes doesn't mean their eyes are the exact same shade of blue. The reason for that is that the traits are made by more than one gene, right? So poly meaning multiple, genic meaning gene. So these are traits that are determined by more than one gene. A good way to know if it's polygenic is, again, you're looking at variation. If there's lots of variation within that trait, chances are it's polygenic, right? Skin tone is another example, right? There are lots of variation of skin tone telling us it's based on more than one gene. Sex-linked traits are another kind of complex inheritance. So you know that the sex chromosomes are X and Y. So sex-linked traits are traits that are coded for on either the X or the Y chromosome, right? So for example, eye color is coded for on the X chromosome. Okay, so since eye color is coded, or not eye color, excuse me, seeing color with your eye is coded for on the X chromosome. So it's a sex-linked trait. This means it's going to be more common in one sex. So it's on the X chromosome, which means it's more common in males. Probably not what you were thinking, right? Males, right? You should be like, shouldn't it be in females because they have 2 X's, right? But here's the deal. Since females have 2 X's, if one of them's messed up, we have a backup copy, right? In males, that's not the case. If their X is messed up, they don't have a backup, so they're not going to be able to see color. So for example, my dad is colorblind, right? So I know that one of my X's is messed up, right? Because my dad gave me an X, that's what makes me female, and he only has a messed up X to give, right? He's colorblind. So for me, one of my X's is messed up, but luckily, right, I inherited a normal X from my mom, so I can see color. But when I have a son, right, think of meiosis. When I have a son, I'm going to give him one of my X's, if I have a son, right? So he has a 50-50 chance of being colorblind. So males get it from their mom. Females have to get it from dad, right? In order to a female to be colorblind, they would need it from both mom and dad. And sons can't get it from their dad, right? Because sons get a Y from dad. So sex-linked traits are typically more common in males. So if you're doing research on your genetic disorder and it keeps saying that males get it more often than females, that's a good indicator that it's a sex-linked trait. Another kind of complex inheritance are called risk genes. So this is where a form of the gene puts you at an increased risk for certain diseases. So a lot of cancers are risk genes, right? So rather than you just know for sure you're going to have it, a risk means you're at a higher chance of getting it than the average person. So it's not fully predictable, right? So I might be at a higher chance for ovarian cancer and I might never get ovarian cancer. Or I might be at the normal chance of ovarian cancer and I might get it, right? So it's not as predictable as some of these other disorders. So if you picked from the very last column of genetic disorders, the most complex, a lot of these are risk genes, right? And it makes it harder to predict whether or not these people's children are going to have it. So it is a complex form of inheritance. The other thing that can impact the gene is the environment, right? So yes, your genes are one way that you can get these disorders, but the environment also impacts that, right? So what we see is that people live in certain areas can cause genes to become more or less activated. The way that people live their life, right, can change that. So you might be at risk for a disease, but you might make an environmental or lifestyle change that puts you less at risk. So it's not just your genotype that determines your phenotype. It's also determined by the environment. All right, go back to Schoology to see what the rest of your assignment is. We will go over this tomorrow and make sure that you are good with any questions. Thanks.